I think you all noticed what was happening in the crypto market over the last few days. It was the historically largest liquidation event that has ever occurred in the history of crypto. So even bigger than the COVID crash, even bigger than the Terra Luna crash, and even larger than the FTX crash when Bitcoin was at $16,000. And because of that, as a crypto investor, you naturally start to wonder, how can something like this even happen? What actually happened? What are the effects? Does this crash have long-term consequences for the crypto market? Is the bull market over? Some questions like this have already arisen. We will address this in today's video. And of course, what are the prospects for 2025? What can we really expect? And precisely because I know that the last few days have been extremely emotional, for some crypto investors, I want to provide a particularly rational analysis in today's video about what we can really expect in the coming days and weeks. So please make sure to stick around until the end today. You will take away a lot of value. As I mentioned, I've also prepared a lot here. And as you probably already know from my other videos, my analyses, my theses, and my arguments are all based on numbers, data, facts, and charts. So I will point out specific things here because I think, especially in the current market phase, it's essential and extremely important to rely on numbers, data, and facts and not get caught up in emotions, because I've seen it a lot on Twitter and the question has come up quite frequently, is the bull run over? Many are currently in a panic, and that's exactly why it's especially important for me to be here during such times and provide my analyses for you. Otherwise, just so you know, today's video is more about the bigger picture itself. In the next video, so make sure to tune in again, I'll specifically talk about my moves in my own portfolio. So, which positions have I reduced? What have I reallocated? What has changed in my strategy? I already teased a bit about that last time, but in the next video I will go into this very specifically, which old compositions I have partially sold off, reallocated, and which Bitcoin I am currently focusing on particularly strongly. Because in phases like the current one, where the market reacts quite sensitively to negative news, it's especially important to take a bit of risk off the table from his own portfolio, and that's why I want to make today's video for you. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this kind of content, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. I would definitely be very happy. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments of today's video and about the analyses themselves. Otherwise, let's jump right into Bitcoin. What exactly has happened here? To be honest, if we look at it from a broader perspective, not much has really happened because we are still in this range. Between 91,000 US dollars and 110,000 US dollars, we had actually seen Bitcoin do this quite often before, where it really likes to go through these consolidation phases, and then a pump upwards, consolidation phase again, and then another pump upwards. And we are once again in a consolidation phase and have to wait until Bitcoin reaches new highs. And this will also be noticeable in your own altcoin portfolio as soon as Bitcoin reaches new highs. But as long as Bitcoin remains in this range, you can't really expect much from the altcoin market either. But that's it for now. Otherwise, Bitcoin is holding relatively stable. It's still relevant that Bitcoin holds here in this middle range between 96,000 and 98,000 US dollars, because this is where the highest volume is, and it's particularly important that these price levels hold, that Bitcoin doesn't breaks downwards, because otherwise sooner or later the support will weaken, getting weaker and weaker, simply because the more often, you can also remember this, the more often a support level is tested. The more often a support level is tested, the higher the likelihood that such a support will be broken. Yes, so the weaker the support becomes in that sense. And that's why Bitcoin itself can't afford to dive in here again, because otherwise it's going to be really bitter again, because otherwise we could expect prices of 75,000 or 80,000 US dollars again, which I personally do not expect to happen. Simply because Bitcoin is holding very stable, but I just want you to be informed that these are important price levels for Bitcoin to hold up somewhat so that it can eventually reach new highs. But at this point, as I said, I'm not a trading YouTuber who wants to go deeper into this. Now, if we take a look at the liquidations for Bitcoin, we can see quite clearly that there is quite a bit below us, but there is also quite a bit above us. That's why the probability is currently a bit higher that Bitcoin will reach new highs again, simply because there is quite a bit of liquidity above us. So, from this scenario, I personally assume the most at this point, that Bitcoin is now grabbing the liquidity above us again. As you all know, Daniel, we're now going to touch a bit on the crash. In my opinion, this was pure market manipulation. We see here, Financial sent over $100 million to Wintermute to force the capitulation wave. $8 billion were liquidated, but the masses, and I also wrote a comment about this, the masses are once again looking for scapegoats, Trump, tariffs, China, or whatever. But the truth is, at the end of the day, the market is manipulated. We have to accept that. That's how it is at the end of the day, because the exchanges and market makers earn an incredible amount when positions are liquidated over and over again. So you have to imagine, the market makers intentionally push the price into the areas where they can extract the most liquidity, so where the most stop-loss orders from short positions are located, and that's why this is pure market manipulation that's happening. So you have to be a bit careful not to jump straight into making comments. The bottom is gone or something like that, but of course I can understand that many were super frustrated, just like I was Of course, also because we're mostly focusing more on the old concepts and not necessarily on the new ones. But as I said, we'll talk more about that at the end of the video regarding the altcoin market. So as I said, definitely stay tuned. Otherwise, we see the market manipulations here, and we can take another look at this. The market has basically cleaned itself up, or rather, has in this sense unloaded all the leverage, so it is also relatively common that a lot of tension arises from leverage. And as soon as this liquidation cascade happens, the market can unload itself cleanly again. And this is also noticeable in the funding rates, which are now negative for the very first time again. What's nice to see is that even in a bull run, there are negative funding rates. This also happened back in August during my carry trade that we saw, so during the lease and crash. Even here with small sell-offs, and historically, these negative funding rates are usually a rather positive signal, meaning, let's say, that all the long trades have been washed out, and thus the market can, in a way, reset itself. As I just mentioned, a kind of cleansing has taken place. We can see this quite well here, and historically speaking, such negative funding rates usually indicate the local bottom. So much for that. Otherwise, just so you know, don't let yourselves get washed out in that sense. From the markets, we have a lot of statistics in front of us here that clearly indicate and that it was pure market manipulation, because we can clearly see that, for example, the capital inflows through exchanges in the form of USDC have reached a new all-time high. Here we see, I've summarized it again in a tweet, specifically on the 23rd, January and 5th. In February, the largest exchanges recorded record USDC inflows, and these are actually new all-time highs that we haven't seen since 2022. It's really absolutely incredible what has happened here, and all of this strongly suggests that there have been large market players, or rather, large whales have accumulated significantly again, and accordingly, a systematic redistribution of wealth has taken place from weak hands to professional investors. We can also see this here again, the largest stablecoin inflow of the year. So, we can clearly see this spike upwards that has occurred. It's really brutal. We can also clearly see here with the whales, meaning where larger investors, larger Bitcoin investors who already have relatively big holdings have bought more. And we can see very clearly that here, at the beginning of 2025, there has been another massive accumulation from large whales. And that's why it actually preempts the question I mentioned earlier about whether the bull run is over. So I don't really want to answer that at this point with a yes or no. I just want to present numbers, data, and facts. And at the end of the day, everyone at home can form their own opinion about whether they think the bull run is over when big investors, professional investors are buying like crazy. Yes, as strong as never before. And all of this is also noticeable among retail investors. So since 2025, we have had a clear divide here between the broad masses, the retail investors who are systematically washed out by all the market manipulation, and the whales, the big investors, are filling their pockets at the moment. So we can see quite clearly in which direction this whole thing is heading. That's why I'm not too worried that the big crash is over, especially when big investors are still accumulating endlessly. For example, we can also see very clearly here that yesterday recorded the BlackRock's spot Ethereum ETF saw an inflow of $300 million. So we can clearly see here that we've almost reached new highs with a strong spike upwards. And that's why the trend from the big players is definitely clear in which direction this is going. The big players are accumulating, whether it's BlackRock or investors like Donald Trump's own portfolio. Liberty Financial has also been extremely active. Ethereum has been bought up, so it's really important not to lose sight of the bigger picture here, to observe what big investors are doing, and not necessarily what are my own emotions. Am I currently feeling anxious or something? That has to be put in second place. That's why it's so important for me to shoot these YouTube videos for you, so you really get a clear view of how the market actually stands at the current moment. Also, just to briefly touch on what I want to mention, one naturally asks the legitimate question, if so many whales are accumulating, so many big investors, why is nothing happening with the Bitcoin price? So I think that's a question that many people are concerned about at the moment. Now, we've definitely discussed the topic of what's happening, especially with Bitcoin, that the dip has definitely been bought up from big investors, from whales who are currently filling their pockets again. Now let's touch on a somewhat important, or rather sensitive point, the topic of Bitcoin. What has happened in the altcoin market? If you take a look at Bitcoin, it has seen a sell-off of about 11% since this crash. But if you take a look at the whole thing, with Bitcoin, we have a drop of 52% from the interim high. Just imagine that, where we dipped in between. So I just want to point out what is happening in the overall altcoin market. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, it's always Bitcoin that gets hit the hardest, especially during such sell-offs. And it was really absolutely massive. So I've personally never experienced anything like this in the overall crypto market, that in such a short time, Bitcoin is being washed out so radically. Yes, and you have to imagine, if you take a look at the bubble map here, there are really blue chip projects, big projects like a PP 50%. Also here Sandbox, with Virtual Protocol 70%, Flocky 50%, and we're just looking at the 30-day view. I've even prepared something here. Here we see an overall view from the absolute top, showing how some projects have been punished. You really have to imagine the whole thing What's happening here is, no matter which industry you look at, every altcoin project has been incredibly harshly punished. We're even seeing large blue chip projects that have established themselves in ABEX 82%, NIA 83%. It's really absolutely insane what is happening with the altcoin market. And that's why I can definitely understand that right now the overall market sentiment actually resembles that of a very, very deep bear market. Bear market. So you really have to imagine we are actually in a very good position right now with the crypto market. We have very, very good news. We have good new regulations. So especially with the topic of the SEC, or generally what support Trump is proposing. And that's why I would say it's a big paradox that the market is incredibly strong, but the overall sentiment is absolutely in the basement, completely at rock bottom. And I can absolutely understand it because there are a large number of investors here, not necessarily invested in Bitcoin, but more into Bitcoin. And I want to be completely honest with you here. I don't want to sugarcoat anything at all. Personally, I'm also massively, massively in the red with my own altcoin portfolio. So you definitely don't want to look at that right now. That's why it's really important to use these phases as a learning experience, or rather, it also adapts accordingly. That's why it was personally important to me to cut some positions from my own altcoin portfolio. As I said, there will be another video coming in the next few days. There, I will go a bit deeper into the topic of Bitcoin, what exactly has happened here, and what my next moves are. And even big investors who are relatively well known in the space, we've lost a total of 30 million. For example, Murat, some of you should know him as well. Here we see his portfolio. He hasn't sold anything yet. And at the end of the day, it's exactly those investors who, in my opinion, will win. So you just have to imagine it that way. I think each of us has our own crypto portfolio, maybe a few thousand euros to 100,000 euros. However, depending on the investors, of course, but I would say here, we already have big investors who are losing 30 million. I just want to highlight the reality of how things really are at this point in the crypto market, because many other influencers sometimes lie or sometimes don't address unpleasant truths at all. And I definitely don't want to do that here on my YouTube channel. So in the end, I say we're all in the same situation right now. That's the current state. I mentioned the important points again. At the end of the day, we're all in the same boat. It's a psychological war here. And only those who persevere will reap the rewards. That's how it is at the end of the day. Yes, I will definitely talk specifically about the topic of altcoin season in the next video. So we will definitely talk about some important points again. Let's get started. Otherwise, what I just want to express is, yes, don't blame yourselves if your portfolio is in the red when it comes to Bitcoin. At the end of the day, it's part of it. We are still in an upward trend when it comes to the total crypto market cap. That's why I'm not worried at this point. Also, don't worry that the cycle has somehow been broken or anything like that. We've also seen that accordingly, as soon as Bitcoin reaches new highs, altcoins also reach new highs. So that's why I'm not worried at all that we'll return to old levels. So we can see here on the 4th, from November to the 1st of December, we saw a very nice increase in Bitcoin. I think each of you has noticed in your own crypto portfolio how certain positions are also gaining traction. Yes, especially in such a market, it's just particularly tough right now, but you have to understand that it's just cleanups that are happening, current market from weak investors to strong investors, because you have to imagine, just to explain this briefly, so you really understand this principle, it's simple in itself, but to illustrate it again, we have altcoin positions, right? And when Bitcoin is penalized by a certain percentage, you have to imagine that when a drop happens, there still need to be as many sellers, as there are buyers at those levels. So at the end of the day, there is always some counterparty that will buy the coins at exactly that price. And we simply have to ask you the question, who is selling here, perhaps out of emotion, or most likely at a loss? And who is buying here? Who is taking advantage of the current opportunities, even though the market is currently looking absolutely terrible and Bitcoin is bleeding out extremely, extremely badly? So you really have to ask yourself, which side are you on? At the end of the day, are you one of the winners in this cycle or one of the losers? So that's really very important, that you don't necessarily exclude your own emotions. What I can recommend to you is to use your own emotions as a counter indicator. For example, if you feel extreme fear in these areas, then it's often a good time to buy here. And of course, in contrast, back in late February and early December, when the mood was extremely bullish, we had incredibly huge prospects, and you could really see that some people were getting greedy. Those are usually good times to take some profits. Of course, you're always smarter in hindsight. I'll be honest with you, I also have way too little realizing profits simply because you understand my approach here. My personal plan has always been, and still is, to find an exit, for the most part, in the crypto market as soon as we reach new all-time highs here. So, with the total crypto market cap from the altcoin chart, as soon as we reach price levels here or here, total valuation of 1 trillion, something in that range, as soon as we basically double the next all-time high. Of course, it's also very important to take profits here. It takes with it on the way up, which I honestly didn't expect at all. That we see such a big crash just before the last all-time high in the altcoin market. And precisely because of that, I personally wasn't quite as prepared. I was a bit over-invested. That's why it's really important to take some risk out of your portfolio at this point. so that you're better prepared during these, let's say, consolidation phases with Bitcoin. That's definitely it for now. Otherwise, let's talk a bit about the core topic. Is the bull run over, or what can we really expect? Then I'll just mix in here. Again, there is a correlation between the traditional markets and Bitcoin itself. Here, I've prepared the Nasdaq 100, which includes the 100 largest tech stocks in the USA. And here we can take a look at the chart, and we can see quite clearly that the behavior compared to Bitcoin is very, very similar. Here we can also see a clear upward trend, currently a consolidation phase. And it's exactly the same thing that's happening with Bitcoin. We're currently seeing a consolidation phase with Bitcoin here. And exactly the same thing is happening here with the S&P. And you have to understand the connections here. If I want to point something out, at the end of the day, everything is ultimately dependent on monetary policy, so basically macroeconomic factors. Then come the traditional markets, then comes Bitcoin, and then comes Bitcoin. And of course, you have to understand that if the overall economy is doing poorly, if there are bad macroeconomic factors, or if monetary policy isn't supporting it, then the traditional markets won't do well, Bitcoin won't do well, and at the end of the day, Bitcoin will be the worst off. So it's personally important to me that you understand everything is interconnected at the end of the day. At the end of the day, everything is interconnected. And precisely because of that, it makes sense to look at what the traditional financial markets are doing. Because as soon as new highs are reached here, new highs will automatically be reached with Bitcoin as well. We can illustrate this quite well here. We also see individual interim highs happening here, which are also occurring with Bitcoin. Individual interim lows are also occurring here with Bitcoin, both with the S&P and with Bitcoin here again. And as soon as the S&P takes off, we also see here Bitcoin breaks out further and accelerates. And then here again in the next example, it's really crazy how the correlation is present. As soon as the Nasdaq 100 reaches its interim high here, exactly in this area, we also saw that Bitcoin reached its peak, its interim high. Then we can also continue to observe here, during the consolidation phase, the Nasdaq 100 has been somewhat punished. Let's take a look here. The Nasdaq was at about 6%. Accordingly, Bitcoin dropped again, then the Nasdaq picked up, and Bitcoin also picked up. And that's exactly how the correlation is always present. And to briefly address the core question here, is the bull run over? Everyone at home can now ask themselves, do you think that the Nasdaq 100, the 100 largest tech stocks, has reached its absolute all-time high so that we are now transitioning into a global recession, into a massive crash? Yes, so you can ask yourselves that question, and in my opinion, it's rather ridiculous to think that the Nasdaq 100 is completely topped out, that it's over. Because you also have to keep certain indicators and macroeconomic factors in mind. Here, for example, I have a dashboard open, and you can take a good look at it. What are the current macro recession indicators? Is there currently a fear of recession in the market? And here we can see quite well, no matter what I'm looking at, whether it's the unemployment rates, job openings, whatever, everything is currently more than good in the green zone. Of course, we have the interest rates, so basically the key interest rates, which could be somewhat, problematic, simply because we are currently at a relatively high level. That is, of course, the question of all questions, when the money printers will be turned back on. But I would say, overall, when you look at the big picture, regarding the topic of a global crash, global recession, and that's simply because of the current data, I personally find it relatively unlikely that the Nasdaq has reached its absolute peak here. And now something like this is happening over the next few months. I find it rather unrealistic in my opinion. And on the other hand, if we can assume again that the Nasdaq will reach new all-time highs, then Bitcoin will immediately follow suit. That's the logical conclusion, because there is a certain coupling between the traditional markets and Bitcoin. And in my opinion, it's just a matter of time until Bitcoin starts to rise again. And as we all know, when Bitcoin starts to rise, that is when Bitcoin reaches new highs, just like in the upswing from November 5th to December 1st, where we also saw this rally in Bitcoin, where it almost doubled. November to 1st December, where we also saw this rally in Bitcoin, where Bitcoin almost doubled. Over a few weeks, we also saw that in the altcoin market, Bitcoin performed very, very well. So we really shouldn't worry too much that it's completely over, that the bull run is cancelled, and that Bitcoin will never perform again, or anything else. So, at the end of the day, you definitely shouldn't let yourselves be unsettled. From any comments or anything else on Twitter, always consider the bigger picture and draw your own conclusions. Yes, so I want to approach this on my YouTube channel, in my YouTube videos, by putting forward certain theses, certain conclusions, and when I see a clear correlation here, then that correlation will also be maintained. As soon as Bitcoin enters the overheated zone, we can take another look at this. As soon as Bitcoin really gets overheated and is close to its all-time high, we will also see a very, very strong drop in Bitcoin dominance. And that way, liquidity can also be released for the altcoin market. So we just have to be patient. And we just have to wait for this breakout to happen. That there will be another leg up towards 120, 130, 140,000 US dollars. In my opinion, this will be one final move from the crypto market. And you have to be careful, to be honest. You really need to watch out that you don't fall into the trap of another push upwards. Yes, and then we see another consolidation phase. Then we see Bitcoin bleeding out again. Because then, I'll be honest with you, when Bitcoin reaches these price levels, let's say around 120,000, 130,000 US dollars, then it could really be the case that the all-time high is in for now and that Bitcoin cools off significantly. And if Bitcoin does something like that, then I honestly don't want to know what happens with Bitcoin. That's why you need to be extremely careful. So the next time Bitcoin, if there's another run-up, as soon as good euphoria kicks in, I would definitely start taking some profits so that you at least get your initial investment back, and then you can just let the profits run in your own portfolio. That's also my personal plan, to have pulled out my initial investment by May 2025. In the altcoin portfolio, that's definitely it for now. Otherwise, as we discussed at the beginning, let's talk about a few overarching charts regarding Bitcoin itself. Here we see, for example, the fair value graph of Bitcoin. So historically speaking, since 2011, Bitcoin represented, and we can see quite clearly that Bitcoin is far from being in an overheated area, not at all, basically in the unfair area. We can see here that we are still in the lower band of the fair value range. So, in my opinion, the comments that the cycle is somehow over are simply not justified. Or similar, no matter which indicators I look at. For example, we can also see here in the logarithmic regression that Bitcoin is still in the green zone, not overheated yet. So, in my opinion, we can still expect quite a bit. In the coming days and weeks, we also see the P-cycle top indicator, which has historically been accurate up to this point. Every time it was right, I mean every single time. We can take a look here, and we see two median values, two average values represented in green and red. And as soon as these lines cross, simply put, we've seen it at that point. We had a crossing of the lines in 2013 and 2014, which was relatively close to the top. Then we can take a big look at the whole thing again. So, the next crossing happened again in 2018. It was exactly at the top, so again here, perfectly predicted by this indicator. As I said, we are of course only relying on historical data here, but we can derive quite well from that what signals the indicator is giving us at the current time. We can also see here that the last top was perfectly or almost perfectly called by this indicator, and we can zoom in on that. So, as I said, the indicator is based on observing when the red line crosses the green line, and then we can assume that Bitcoin is really in the top range or simply close to its all-time high. And right now, we can see quite well that even though we are in a bull run, and Bitcoin is over 100,000 US dollars, we see the median value here, so the red line is almost right at the price where we currently are. So, we are currently at the lower edge of the red line, and we are still far from the point where the red line crosses the green line. So, we definitely still have a lot of potential to go up, which is why I'm not worried at all right now that the cycle is somehow already over. Or something similar. So no matter what I look at, we can also see here the short-term bubble risk. What also works quite well is that we can see relatively clearly, based on the red bars, when it really became very, very critical for Bitcoin, when it was critical, so to speak, close to the all-time high. And we can even see at the moment, you have to imagine, if we zoom in on this area, we can even see that we are now in the green, even though Bitcoin is over 100,000 US dollars. So you can really see that the cycle is far from being overheated. We are far from being in a critical area where you really have to worry seriously that the cycle is over. So we see here basically the data from the last cycle where we were deep red for a long period of time, like really deep red. And at the moment we were briefly yellow and now even partly green again. So we also had green at times here in areas back when it was at 20,000 US dollars for Bitcoin, where Bitcoin was absolutely not overheated. So we can see quite well again what this indicator gives us here. Of course, these are just indicators. Of course, there are no set rules that it has to happen exactly the same way again. But still, you just have to imagine, if I have access to several hundred indicators, and I'm looking at 200 indicators, and out of those 200 indicators, 199 indicators give me a signal that there is still no cycle top. So why should I be worried that the bull run is somehow over, or something like that? So no matter what you look at, everything is still in a very decent and normal range. If we take a look at the cycles here, I can remove the others, we can see quite clearly that the parallels to the 2017 cycle are still very much present, or rather, the correlation is definitely there. And we can also see that in the 2017 cycle, there was that last push upwards, and it was exactly that push that triggered what I would call another altcoin season. And we simply don't see that happening at the moment. We just have to be patient until Bitcoin catches up. But even here, the correlation is still present, even when you zoom in. It's very, very similar to the last cycle, so Bitcoin is doing exactly what it needs to do. He's following the template step by step, and that's why I'm relatively relaxed at the moment regarding the Bitcoin cycle itself. So everything is going completely normal according to plan. Otherwise, where you can understandably be a bit worried is, of course, the altcoin market. What is Ethereum doing? Why is Ethereum bleeding out so much compared to Bitcoin? And what's the deal with monetary policy? So, in the next video, I'll talk about what my personal forecast is. For the overall alcohol market, what can we expect? Does it even make sense to invest heavily in alcohol, or possibly right now, there's actually a very good opportunity to invest in altcoins because we might be at a turning point here. We'll talk about that in the next video. That's definitely it for today's video. I really hope that you got a good overview of the market itself and the cycle. So I really put a lot of effort into gathering all the value in today's video and also putting together all the research for you. If you like the content, feel free to follow me on my X account, Vincent Crypto. That way, you'll definitely stay updated and see all the analyses that I'm doing here. Otherwise, as I said, that's it for today's video. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments about whether you think the cycle is already over or something like that. Were you panicking in the last few days? It's also very good to analyze yourself here to really see how you actually react to such crashes. That's why you can really only learn from the last few days. That's definitely it for that. Don't let yourselves get down, especially in such market phases. I also want to say that we definitely stick together, especially in our community. It's important to me that everyone supports each other, especially during tougher market phases like right now, that we just stand together. Otherwise, I sincerely thank you for your attention. If you enjoy these kinds of videos, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. And then I would say, see you in the next video.